So we're going to get started. Today's program is entitled Adolescent Reproductive Health, the Challenges and Benefits of Delaying Sex. My name is Sandeep Bathala, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The program is 18 years old, and we look at the various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. Today's program is brought to you today as part of our HELPS project, which stands for Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security. It's a 5-year effort generously funded by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. As many of you know, the Wilson Center is a formal memorial to our 28th president, the only president thus far to have achieved a PhD. Here at the center, we aim to bring together the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding of how to inform each other. You have bios in front of you today, so I want to direct your attention now to our 3 speakers. Jean Roque-Partain is the Vice President of Research and Development at Search Institute. Lorette Kakuza is a Senior Technical Advisor for Reproductive Health at CEDPA, the Center for Development and Population Activities. And Kate Lane is a Youth Health Advisor for the Service Delivery and Improvement Division at the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID. A note about today's program, it is being webcasted live, so when we do come to the discussion portion, I'd ask you to use a mic, and my colleagues will be coming around if you have a question. Please do use them so the folks tuning in will be able to hear you. We're actually going to get started then. We're going to have Jean go first, then Lorette, and then Kate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do I need to put up the next slides, or? I'll let you worry about that. Thank you. It's good to be with you today, all the way from Minnesota. I know that you work internationally, and that's kind of an international country. To some, no. It's great to be with you. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting this important event and making it possible for me to be here. It's wonderful to be here. I want to do 4 things, and I want to limit my time so there's time for dialogue. Let me just say what those are. First, I want to introduce to you the framework of developmental assets, which is a framework we've been using for about 20 years to understand positive development in children and youth. Then after that, what I want to do is highlight the connections between developmental assets or positive youth development and sexual activity among adolescents and young adolescents. Then I want to tie that to our newest research looking at assets in developing countries that was sponsored by USAID, and then finally try to pull that together and begin to think about some of the implications of that for the work that we're doing and the issues that are at hand. Just to give you some context, Search Institute is a not-for-profit organization based in Minneapolis. We've been around about 50 years with a commitment to helping discover what kids need to succeed in their families, schools, and communities. Our work has been largely in the United States, but in the last decade has begun expanding through our partners into work in other countries. And so we're honored to be part of that work and to have many of you as partners. At the core of our work has been this framework of developmental assets. And we're going to spend a few minutes just talking about the assets and the framework. It's a way of thinking about youth development in concrete, tangible ways. We based it in extensive research, about 1,000 journal articles that have fed into the framework, as well as surveys in the United States now of 3.5 million young people ages about 4th grade through 12th grade. And so a really large database over time of kids, both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. We survey about 100,000 kids every year in the United States in school districts as part of their community mobilization efforts for understanding their own kids. So it's grounded in research. It is both flexible and adaptable because it's a framework, not a program. It's a way for people to engage in it in ways that fit who they are, their mission, and their priorities. It's actionable, so it's grounded in theory and grounded in research, but it's also actionable and practical. There are things you can do to build assets. And it has impact across priority areas, and we'll talk about that. Beginning to see that assets matter for a lot of things we care about in our society and in our work internationally. And then finally, it's really relevant across many populations as we've studied it, and we'll show some data on this across different populations of youth. It's relevant across different sectors. It's not just a public sector issue. We use it with education, we use it with nonprofits, we use it with healthcare, we use it with faith-based organizations. A wide range of contexts utilize the asset framework to help them understand how they develop and grow their kids. And so it can be valuable in building connections around that. It tends to be used across ideologies, across the aisle, if you will, and across different perspectives, and we could spend time talking about that. And we're learning now that it's relevant across cultures, that the assets seem to both connect with people and their own value systems within their cultures, and it has some empirical evidence that it matters in terms of the outcomes we care about in different cultures. So that's the basics of the framework, and it's a very simple framework. You can find it online. You just put in developmental assets. You'll find lists of them for different ages and different languages and things. But it's essentially 8 categories of things kids need to succeed. That's not the technical way of describing it, but you get the idea. First, they need things in their community, the external assets that they need at families, schools, communities, other places, to provide love and support so they know they're valued. They have empowerment, the opportunities to contribute and make a difference, to take control of their own lives. Boundaries and expectations, that they know what's expected of them and they know that some things are in limits and some things are out of limits in society for their own good and for the good of the culture. And then finally, they need good ways to spend their time. Constructive use of time, spending time at home, spending time in their community and youth programs, spending time in faith-based organizations, any of the other places that are constructive influences, having those opportunities to grow and develop. Those are all external assets. We named 20 of them specifically, and you can go online and find those. If you look at internal assets, it's the kind of strengths we need to build in our young people so that they can make their own strong choices around a commitment to learning, being engaged in learning in whatever the circumstances they're in. Positive values around honesty, integrity, social justice, restraint, other things that generally in society we believe are important for kids. We know there's some areas of value that there's a lot of debate. We tried to name some things that most of us will agree are important for our young people. Social competencies, the skills to put their values and beliefs into action around friendship-making skills, decision-making skills, dealing with conflict nonviolently. And then finally, a positive identity, a clear understanding of their own purpose, power, and promise in the world. So those are 40 of them, and we could spend a lot of time, workshops talking about them, but to give you an idea, they're basic building blocks of healthy development that matter across a wide range of kids. One of the things I want to say is they're not everything. We know that we're talking about the developmental infrastructure of kids. Kids need other things too. They need a political and economic infrastructure in their society. They need the health and service infrastructure to have access to the other things. They need the educational and civic infrastructure. So developmental assets aren't all that kids need, but they're an important part that we sometimes neglect when we pay attention to only building the other parts of the infrastructure in a society. Why does any of this matter? Well, this is our data from the kids that we study in the U.S. As we look at the level of 40 assets, this is based on 89,000 kids we surveyed in 2010. About 1 in 10 reaches what we call an optimal level, 30 or more of the assets. And between 10 and 15% are at risk with fewer than 10 of the assets that they self-report in their own surveys. And so we see that as a call to action. The average kid in America has only about 19 of the 40 assets. And we've surveyed wide ranges of communities and different populations. And so we can talk more about that, but that's to give you the idea. The asset foundation is too shaky for too many of our kids. And we see that in the States, and I think we're now beginning to see that in the same way you're experiencing it in work in other countries. Why does this matter? We consistently see that the more assets kids have, the better off they are. The more assets, the better. There's increased risk behaviors. Excuse me, that was wrong. There's increased thriving behaviors, reduced risk behaviors, and increased resilience, or ability to overcome the challenges that they face based on the accumulation of the number of assets they experience. So in the same way that with risk behaviors, they compound and they spiral on each other, we see the same patterns with assets. The more they have, the better. Creates a cycle of positive development in the same way that you can see a spiral of negative development when risk factors compound. Okay? So I've said this is true in the United States across lots of different populations, and as I'll show you, you're beginning to see it internationally as well. Why does any of it matter from another perspective? Let's look at some specific charts. If you look at the green bar, those are young people who self-report having 0 to 10 of the assets. Compared to the purple bar are those who report they have 11 to 20. Orange bar is 21 to 30, and red bar is 31 to 40. So just the cumulative number of assets. And you see in the US sample, those who say they take care of the health, doing things like exercise, eating well, and getting enough sleep, the number of assets they have is directly associated with their reports on their health behaviors. On doing well in school, the same pattern holds. And the overall level is different, but the pattern holds. Those with the lowest levels of assets have the lowest levels of thriving around these behaviors. If we look at the other side, on violence, 60% of the kids with 0 to 10 assets report being involved in violent acts, hurting other people, engaging in fighting and that kind of stuff, compared to 4% of those with 31 to 40 of the assets. Alcohol use 15 times more likely between those with low assets and those high assets. So the pattern holds. We actually measure 10 different high-risk behavior patterns, and we see the same basic relationship between level of assets and the specific outcomes. Now, just to be clear, different assets matter differently for different outcomes, so you can get into the detail of some of those weeds, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we talk about sexual activity. If we look specifically at sexual intercourse, this is young people, youth in the United States who say they have reported sexual intercourse 3 or more times. So we're not looking for the one time. This is the pattern is beginning to be established. And we see in our sample, this is 6th to 12th graders. 34% of those with low assets have engaged in sexual activity 3 or more times. If you just look at the older youth, the number goes way up, by the way, of course. So if you're looking across the age span, compared to 3% who say that they've had sexual intercourse 3 or more times with 31 to 40 of the assets. And when we look a little deeper, we see that when we do the regression analyses, demographics explain about 14% of the difference in levels of sexual activity. The 3 assets explain 19% of the variance after you've controlled for the demographics. So, and restraint, the belief that I should not either use alcohol or be engaged in sexual activity, that personal belief, which is an internal value, explains 17%, positive peer influence another %, and time at home, not running around with your friends more than 2 nights a week with nothing to do. Those 3 assets then explain 19% of the variance in levels of sexual activity. And then if we look at it, those with high assets are 6 to 7 times less likely to engage in sexual intercourse than those with average level of assets, about half. So again, it really seems there's a significant difference, a significant correlation. Now, just because somebody's going to ask, we haven't done this is not an intervention study, it's a correlation of cross-sectional data. So I know that there's a whole other layer of research that we need to do to confirm this. The point here is it's suggestive that the positive development of kids really matters. Now, just to turn briefly to our international data, we did a study that we're just now releasing, and if you want a copy of it, I don't think it's on our website yet, but if you email me, I will send that to you. We're getting it up, where we studied, trying to examine whether developmental assets tied to international development priorities in 4 countries. We used another instrument that we'll talk about called the Developmental Assets Profile, and we did survey research in 4 countries, Honduras, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and Jordan, all areas where we did the research. And we did about between 600 and 1,000 kids in each country. The samples weren't comparable. They were worked with programs in each area to do the samples. Our main interest was to see if the relationships within the survey data were held true for this population as well. What we see is across these four countries, when we on this measure we look at assets from 0 to 60. It's a long story, but go with me. And average is still at about the midpoint in terms of how we scale it. So across each of these countries, the average score on 0 to 60 was between 41 and 36, 42 and 46. So even with very different populations in each countries, we're finding similar patterns of asset levels. And that score doesn't vary much by age, gender, or the city or village. So the total, it seems to be a fairly stable measure across a wide variety of young people. We then link the assets to 5 priority areas, including health. And I'm just going to dive into health a minute, where we asked about their knowledge of HIV, sanitation practices, access to medical care, and we had hoped to ask about sexual activity and around sexual activity, birth control use, number of sexual partners and some things like that. And we got resistance in the country offices, and due to a variety of factors, we chose not to pursue that and weren't able to include that in these studies. So as much as I'd love to report those data today, I don't have them. So we'll just have to go with that. So if you look at the 5 outcome areas we measured, assets were correlated positively on a Cohen's correlation between 0.41 and 0.21. And those of you who aren't in statistics won't really know what that means. So it means there's something meaningful going on, we think, in behavioral sciences. This is about the level, about 2.1, 2.29 is about the level of teacher impact on student achievement. So just to give you a context score. So if it was 0, that means there's no relationship. If it was 100, it means it explains everything. And in this case, it's explaining some of the variance. Usually it's about, it varies by the outcome. We were surprised that the workforce readiness is one where it was the strongest. So we think there's something useful going on here to say that these assets matter among vulnerable people in developing countries. Obviously, we still have more work to do. But let me just in conclusion throw out what I think might be some takeaways from what we're seeing so far. First of all, we think that assets are relevant across multiple individual differences, across multiple contexts, cultures, and situations. Doesn't mean they work exactly the same in all those places. There's a lot of work to contextualize them for each country. There's other things that you have to do. But we think as a framework, there's something here to work with. We see that correlation. They're related to some priorities that we have. And again, more research needed. We always say that. Every researcher says that. More research is always needed. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface. We think there's more work to be done. An asset-based approach holds promise across a variety of priority areas. This is essentially the hope of a youth development approach and how we link youth development with prevention and all of those other things I know is part of your conversation. But we think that focusing on identifying and building the strengths in young people complements the efforts to prevent the problems. And figuring out how the two work together may be able to explain more of that variance in outcomes that we're working on together. Finally, the idea that building assets calls for engagement across a community, across multiple sectors of a young person's life. What's very clear as you look down the list of the assets and think about the ecology of development, which is the philosophical orientation we come from, is that no single institution, no single program can build all 40 assets. It just doesn't work. Kids don't grow up in programs. They grow up in families and communities. So how do we design programs? How do we design interventions in institutions that help build the capacity of families, communities, and the others in young people's life, and young people themselves to have the strengths that they need to grow up well? I see that as both a challenge and an opportunity for us moving forward, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Jean. That was a great intro to what I'm going to present on, some programming in the developing world. And good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for asking me to participate in this conversation. And I'm so happy to see so many people who are interested in this very important topic. And so I look forward to our discussion. Let's see, now I have to. Okay. Programs have sought to provide adolescents with knowledge, skills, and agency that can help them delay sex and navigate the transition from childhood to adulthood more safely, with the ultimate aim of full participation in their own development and that of their communities and countries. I will discuss some of the challenges in implementation, lessons learned, and windows of opportunity that can help girls and boys delay sexual debut, make healthier transitions to adulthood, and make lasting social change. So who are adolescents? According to UNICEF's 2011 State of the World's Children Report, Adolescence and Age of Opportunity, we're looking at the largest cohort of adolescents in history at 1.2 billion, with 90% living in the developing world. Just to give you an idea of the need for interventions that delay sexual debut, here's a look at women aged 15 to 19 in East and Southern Africa. With the exception of Rwanda, you can see that large proportions of both married and unmarried women are having sex. As many of you know, and I know because I have a 13-year-old son, adolescence can be very challenging. It is a time of intense changes in physical, mental, emotional, sexual, and social realms, spanning a period of several years and with great potential and also risk. These transitions happen at different rates for females and males, with girls about a year or two ahead of boys, and vary with cultural and social norms and conditions. Adolescents are often lumped into groups such as 10 to 19 or 15 to 24, but there are vast differences between adolescents at different ages. Programs aimed at larger groupings often miss the windows of opportunity for early and nuanced approaches that can have lasting effects and provide protection from a myriad of health risks that contribute to high maternal and child mortality and morbidity. Boys too are at risk and often pressured into early sex, and the consequences can be dire. Programs targeting specific stages of adolescence, particularly very young adolescents, show promise in delaying sexual debut and developing more equitable gender and social norms. Promising approaches work with developing cognitive processes, susceptibility to peer influences, and prepare kids for the huge bodily and emotional changes that characterize this time. Okay, there are many adolescent programs out there, and some of you are doing a fabulous job with them. But I'm going to focus on 6 of those that I'm familiar with working at SEDPA. The Better Life Options and Opportunities model has been used in many developing countries with various modes of implementation since 1989. On an individual level, it gives adolescents safe spaces to acquire skills, explore options, and translate them into action for healthy living, including sexual and reproductive health. It also creates an enabling environment through mobilization and advocacy with key stakeholders and capacity building for partners to promote sustainability. Programs have used some form of the Choose a Future curriculum with in and out of school youth in urban and rural areas, mostly aimed at the poor, vulnerable, and isolated. Modes of implementation have included 6 to 9 month weekly meetings, intensive camps of 2 to 4 weeks, after school and in-school programs with girls, boys, separately and together, and from ages for 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 10 to 19, 15 to 24, so running the gamut. The curriculum has been adapted to fit adolescents' needs in specific contexts, and modules have been added or changed as those needs are better understood or change, such as for gender-based violence or financial literacy. It is even being piloted now as a new technology format. In India, Bloom has been implemented almost continuously since 1989. Program evaluations and impact studies have shown positive results for gains in sexual and reproductive health knowledge and agency in adolescents, particularly girls. One study measured the impact of decision-making on reproductive health behavior. Oh, I think I gotta have it myself. Of alumni from the program, aged 15 to 26 years, as compared with a similar cohort group not exposed to the program. Significant differences included some alumni being more likely to be literate, to have completed secondary education, and be employed or have learned a skill, a vocational skill. Better Life program girls were more likely to make autonomous decisions about going to the market, spending what they earned, and deciding when to marry. A significantly higher number were married at age 18 or older and reported use of contraception. Married alumni who had experienced pregnancy were more likely than controls to have received perinatal care and have delivered in a health facility. Changing completely, Udon Towards a Better Future is an ambitious public-private partnership model used for scaling up adolescent programming in Jharkhand state. SEDPA India worked with the State AIDS Control Society and Government of Jharkhand to implement the program for 9th and 11th graders in all public schools across the state. The curriculum was adapted collaboratively with stakeholders, and intensive advocacy with parents, media, and communities from the outset allowed implementation to continue, even as adolescent health education programs came under fire in other states. Scaling up was successful, but not without its challenges and lessons learned. Program evaluations showed that younger students gained more knowledge and attitude change in some of the domains measured. Students that attended classes more regularly also gained more, suggesting more exposure is needed for lasting change. As a result, the program is being modified to reach students in 7th and 8th grades, and advocacy efforts are focusing on getting the class to be a graduation requirement for graduation. It was important to sensitize school principals and advocate with governments at all levels. Teachers needed more pre- and in-service training to become comfortable with delivering reproductive health and gender subject matter. The Bloom model used in Nepal was largely peer-driven, with adolescents facilitating the curriculum and becoming agents of change. Programs were conducted in the West, the Terai, and in conflict areas, with emphasis on low-income illiterate girls aged 10 to 19. In one program, girls were able to challenge and even change menstrual taboos. In another, they convened national congresses, girls' congresses, to ask Nepal's leaders to include girls as a priority in health and development. This was as the constitution process was going forward, I think. Recently, peer health educators in teams of 3 led weekly discussions reaching 2,400 of their peers, and then together they reached out to households in marginalized Muslim and Dalit neighborhoods, reaching almost 17,000 men and women with reproductive health and family planning information. In Southern Africa, we adapted to reach 10 to 14-year-old girls in schools and to address the real risks of HIV and gender-based violence. In an age-appropriate approach with small group discussions led by teachers and later by alumni, older alumni, included critical thinking and communication skills. An innovative intergenerational communication approach used intensive private and joint sessions between youth and family members. This built bridges between adolescents and their parents who may not have had correct information or the skills to have that kind of conversation with their children. It was also important to train and mentor project staff in program management, finance, and monitoring and evaluation to provide sustainability. In Akwa Ibom State in Nigeria, HIV prevalence is high, primary school attendance is low, and poverty is rampant. The Better Life Options program was aimed at creating a sustainable program for girls and boys 10 to 19, encouraging them to return to formal or vocational schools. The program established project support committees of village chiefs, women leaders, religious leaders, and youth to support specific program activities. And enabling innovation was to provide 15 trainings for these committees, including leadership, monitoring and evaluation, and fundraising and conflict mitigation. The addition of work-study scholarships contributed to increased enrollment. And this was one of our graduates of the program. I keep thanking God every day for making me join this program. I have told my friends all about a work plan. I have never heard that word before. I joined the work-study program. Now I'm a full-time office worker. There are many things I can do in an office, and I'm not ashamed to work in any office anymore. In conclusion, in Egypt, sorry. SEDPA implemented the Blue Model in Egypt under the New Horizons and New Visions programs. Implemented by NGOs and youth centers, the program built confidence, improved communication, and changed perspectives on gender roles, education, and health. New Vision boys reported improved coping skills and more equitable views regarding gender norms. The Ishraq project, currently implemented by the Population Council, on which SEDPA was an early partner, has added safe spaces for girls to play sports. That's another way to do this. Finally, my belief, and I know I'm not the only one that believes this, is that the best way to delay sexual debut is to reach very young adolescents, age 10 to 14, or even earlier, with age-appropriate, comprehensive sexual reproductive health education, and to get them and keep them in schools. Important, too, is creating linkages with health services to ensure that adolescents don't fall off the radar and only show up when it's too late. And to provide the supportive environment in families and communities in which they can build skills, confidence, and self-efficacy to make healthy and safe transitions to adulthood. More research, of course, is needed, and programs and advocacy for those programs. Investing in adolescents now is a window of opportunity to a better future. Thank you.
I apologize for my informal dress. I woke up this morning and completely forgot I was doing this today until I got to work. I'm a little scattered because I just took my 18-year-old son off to college. And so
Mine started high school yesterday.
I'm a little like, what happened here? So thank you so much. I think you guys have laid a very nice sort of foundation for what I want to talk about a little bit about, what USAID is trying to do to address this particular age group. And I was going through some of the data this morning. Thank God you all did the data stuff because I'm really not good at the data stuff. But one of the things that really struck me was the WHO reports that 14% of girls under the age of 15 are married, and 2 million girls under the age of 15 give birth each year. And so in my mind, if we are to really achieve USAID's goals of reducing high-risk pregnancies, unsafe abortions, HIV, reducing maternal mortality, improving child survival, increasing the use of contraception, stabilizing population growth, all the things that USAID is working hard to do, we really have to understand how we instill and sustain positive behaviors among this group of very young adolescents instead of trying to change those negative and often entrenched behaviors when people are older. But let me give you a little story. When I first started working in this field of adolescent health, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So I lived it firsthand with young people in secondary schools. And a few years later, I was supporting a project in Nigeria with a group of Ghanaian and Nigerian NGOs to implement a peer education project. And this was modeled on one of the first big peer education programs in Nigeria, which was called MUDAFEM, which was the multidimensional approach to adolescent fertility management. I was like, that's the most hilarious. And they all wore T-shirts that said Mudafem on them. And I was like, what the heck does that mean? Anyway. So the program was developed after a university student had died as a result of an unsafe abortion, and the university decided that it needed to do more to provide university students with sexuality and reproductive health information and services. So our own project aimed to build on the experiences of Mudafem in 10 other communities working with young people in schools and in some cases out of schools. And initially our partners said, oh, we can only focus on the 20 to 24-year-olds. We couldn't possibly talk about this information with 15 to 19-year-olds. And so after lots of lively discussion and the discussion of the evidence and talking about their own experiences and showing when young people actually did initiate sex and whether or not they were using contraception, they agreed, well, kind of reluctantly, but agreed, well, you're right, maybe we need to do focus on these 15 to 19-year-olds. So a small victory. But it feels to me, despite the work of organizations like SEDPA and Save the Children and other organizations, we have kind of stayed at that 15 to 19 age range. And we've been reluctant to really directly reach out to very young adolescents because we fear community backlash, or we don't really know how to work with very young adolescents because they really rocket through that whole 10 to 14-year-old age range is so diverse and so rich in terms of change. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in that 10 to 14-year-old age period, and I think it's challenging for parents, programmers to figure out what's appropriate for that particular age group. So they often reach these 10 to 14-year-olds informally as part of efforts to teach the older adolescents, but it's really clear that a lot of that information and the programs that are developed for the older kids just really doesn't reach the 10 to 14-year-olds. And so the concern that is often articulated by many is if you talk about sex and if you talk about sexuality, then the young people are going to want to go out and experiment and practice and apply what they've learned. And we know from the research around comprehensive sexuality education that's really not true, that if you provide young people with comprehensive sexuality education, they're more likely to delay, they're more likely to use contraception, they have fewer partners. There's lots of really positive aspects of sexuality education, but I think as adults we often project our own anxieties onto our children and just say if we talk about sex then they're going to want to, I'm going to be catching them out behind the woodshed. Which leads me to my second story. So when my son was about 8 or so, my son who's now in college, I lived and worked in Jamaica on a youth project, and our staff frequently participated in these community education events where we talked about contraception and condoms, and we did condom demonstrations. And so I used to drag my kids out, let's get out of the city and go see how the real people live in Jamaica. So I dragged my son to one of these events, and he was watching it all very curiously and just really entranced by what was going on. And he finally pulled me aside, and he's like, Mom, what are those people doing? And I said, oh, talking about condom use. You want to learn how to do that? And he goes, yeah. And a number of Jamaican parents were just horrified. They're like, oh, my God, you can't talk to an 8-year-old about this kind of stuff. So we got the model, and we got the condoms, and I showed him how to do it, and he did it a few times. He was very proud of himself, and I was like, so you have any more questions? Does this make sense? And he's like, I just have one more question, Mom. How do you pee with that thing on? True story. And I was like, oh, interesting. He clearly did not associate anything that what we had just done with sex. I mean, he knew the penis model. It was a penis model. He knew it was a condom. He knew that the condom went on the penis. But it just, at age of 8, it just wasn't resonating with him that this was something that had to do with sex. And an 8-year-old is still into potty humor. They're still into, so we have to sort of understand that we can provide this information, but it really has to be in their developmental context, and we can't project our own anxiety and our own discomfort. And we had a teachable moment. He initiated the discussion. He learned an important skill that I hope to God he's now using now that he's in college, and he remembers that little incident out in the countryside of Jamaica. And I'm sure he'd be horribly embarrassed if I was telling this story to you.
You can watch the webcast of it.
I did put condoms in his little bag, his little goodie bag. I threw a box of condoms in there. He didn't say anything about it, so. Then they didn't get left at home, so they went to college, yeah. All right, so I'm by no means a very young adolescent expert, but I have a strong interest in this population. I've been, for years I've been saying we need to be doing more with 10 to 14-year-olds, and it's great to see that we are doing much more with this population through, SEDPA, through the Search Institute, through, programs within USAID. And so what I'm just going to sort of wrap up here is talk a little bit about how we are approaching very young adolescents. And I think in my assessment, and I've been here for a year and a half, and this is my own sort of read on the situation, but we're approaching very young adolescents from either perspective of protection or the perspective of development. And so since this age range is so dynamic, since there's so much stuff going on in this 4 years, the lines between the prevention and the protection sometimes get very blurred. And the types of programs that we implement, that they may have both protective elements as well as developmental elements. So within the protection realm, USAID recently appointed a special advisor on children in adversity who reports directly to our administrator. And he's leading an effort to develop an action plan for the U.S. government that provides guidance on how to effectively invest in children from 0 to 18, which includes, of course, the population of very young adolescents. Because, according to them, child development is a cornerstone for all development. And I think that their point is that a lot of our efforts to date within this age range of young people and children has been somewhat fragmented and diffuse. So even though we've produced some substantial benefits, we need to be more comprehensive in scope. So the plan focuses on 3 major themes. One is building strong beginnings to help children not only survive to their 5th birthday, but thrive beyond through comprehensive programs that are promoting the sound development of children and better integration of health, nutrition, and family support. We're also trying to do more to put family first to ensure families are able to care for their children, prevent unnecessary family-child separation, and promote protective family care, a lot of these protective assets, external assets that Jean was talking about, and also just protecting children to ensure national governments are able to deal with incidences of violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect. Some of you may be familiar with the PL 10995, Public Law 10995, which is the congressional mandate to do more. Elizabeth, you probably know more about this than I do, but the congressional mandate to protect vulnerable children, and they do a lot of tracking of what the U.S. government is doing to protect vulnerable children. So this strategy will address PL 10995, but it's a whole of government response to young people, to this age group. So some of the things that have been done under this type of protection framework are the prevention of trafficking of youth across Asia, the Trafficking in Persons Project. This was a partnership with MTV. I think Loretta had mentioned sports programs, and sports programs are extremely popular. Bangladesh, Egypt, Tanzania, Kenya, where they promote girls' education, they help to prevent early marriage, and and in some cases connect very young adolescents with older girls like a big sister, little sister model. The Safe Schools Project has worked to keep girls in school and to make them places of safety by addressing gender norms and gender violence that often affects girls' ability to stay in school. And we've done a lot of work around preventing child marriage. I worked on a project prior to coming to USAID where we did some work in Yemen, which is a hot spot for child marriage, and Yemen deployed community educators to improve community knowledge of the social and health consequences of early marriage, to strengthen child support for keeping girls in school, and also trying to engage the religious leaders in support of advocating for later marriage. Population Council is doing some work to test interventions that are effectively delay marriage, again, such as things like community education, building educational economic assets of girls, and direct incentives like cash transfers to keep girls in school or to delay marriage till the age of 18. So on the youth development side, as many of you know, because I've said this in many forums, as have many of my colleagues, we have drafted a youth and development policy. Who's laughing? Somebody from USAID? Okay. I thought maybe Nicole was here. We are anticipating, we've been saying this for a while, and I really, knock on wood, it's going to happen. The policy is apparently in copy editing. We're really pushing to have the youth and development policy, and we feel like the more we talk about it in public, the more the agency is going to have to follow up and make that policy see the light of day. But the policy, we spent a year working on that policy, and it really advocates for greater consideration to youth between the ages of 10 and 29 within all of the agency's programs. So really trying to capture that 10 to 14-year-old age group, as well as sort of the 15 to 24 age group that a lot of us are more comfortable working in. And then from the more of the employment and civic participation side, the 25 to 29-year-olds. So the policy aims to strengthen our youth programming across the agency and across all sectors. We want to do a better job of mainstreaming and coordinating youth considerations in all of our policies, programs and sectors at the global level as well as at the mission level, and then advance this notion of youth participation, innovation, and partnership. And we very much see the value of the assets-based approach, the cross-sectoral approach, the positive youth development. And so this is a big component of the policy, is really trying to get our programs to adopt more comprehensive multi-sectoral programs and to exploit some of those cross-sectoral synergies between the ministries of health and education and workforce and justice and all these various ministries that are sectors that have some kind of an impact on young people's health and well-being. We promote very strong youth development principles within the policy, which would include youth participation, the assets-based approaches, trying to recognize the diversity of youth. I think a lot of times programs get trapped in this whole youth as a homogeneous block, this monolithic block of youth we must serve. So trying to really tease that out, the young married adolescents, the most at-risk populations, the very young, the older adolescents, so really teasing that out more. Second chance opportunities, there was recently some legislation that was being circulated about trying to prevent child marriage, and a few of us chipped in and said, yes, we're totally behind the prevent child marriage, but we also want to ensure that there are programs for girls once they're married, because those girls tend to fall through the cracks. Recognizing that it takes a village, and so it's not just young people, but it's families, it's communities, it's religious leaders, it's teachers. Everybody has to work together on this. And of course, gender equality. Some of the programs that we have, within our global health office, a few of our programs are addressing very young adolescents within the scope of their overall activities. Georgetown University Institute for Reproductive Health is implementing the GREAT project, which is Gender Roles, Equality, and Transformations. And that's working with very young adolescents in Uganda to promote the formation of gender equitable norms. Because we know education is such an important protective factor for girls and a key factor in their ability to use family planning, the Evidence to Action project is also looking at interventions that will complement and strengthen the effective education on reproductive health. Behaviors of adolescents, such as the delay of sexual initiation, increased use of family planning. So trying to link education with other types of interventions that are successful. Save the Children and a number of NGOs under the Grant Solicitation Management Project have done a lot of work to integrate improved understanding of the reproductive health and developmental needs of very young adolescents within their programs. And again, sports is a big developmental. Like I said, there's for some it's a protection, but in other cases, it's a developmental strategy. Excuse me. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. And there's lots of other things that are happening at missions and with other projects across the agency. But our challenge really is to be able to show if and how these investments in early adolescence lead to those types of outcomes that I mentioned earlier. Does it really delay sexual initiation? Does it really increase use of family planning services? Does it do the things, decrease rates of abortion and maternal mortality? And this is the work that Jean is doing and the work that SEDPA is doing to really try to make this case that these investments intended 14-year-olds really do get us to those particular outcomes that are of interest to our office. So in sum, I'm extremely pleased. After my initial experience 20 years ago where they said we couldn't possibly talk to 15 to 19-year-olds, I'm thrilled that there's much more dialogue going on about this 10 to 14-year-old age group. And I just hope we can continue to push it forward, that it doesn't sort of languish, and we have an opportunity to really pick up the pace and strengthen our investment in this population. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So why don't we open the floor for some questions now? We're going to have 2 microphones around the room that my colleagues will bring around. Please do use them. And for the webcast and for all the audience members here, please introduce yourself and your affiliation. And Carolyn, we have a question up here in the front, or Kate.
Hi. Is this on?
It's on, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I have 2 questions. I'll just ask one right now. I'm Dave Rabinowitz, sorry, independent. And sexual attitudes in this country and also in many places in the world have been changing recently. Just look at the way people look at homosexuality today. My question is, 2 decades ago, a U.S. Surgeon General was forced to resign, basically, because she advocated masturbation. Now, a few years ago, Oprah did a show with, I believe it was Dr. Laura Berman, where they advocated that young girls be encouraged to play with themselves and see what feels good so that they don't associate those good feelings with the first boy who goes around and touches them. I'm just wondering if today it's acceptable to advocate or even just discuss masturbation.
Why don't we pool a couple questions and then we'll have the speakers address them.
Carlos Indacochea, George Washington University. Closely related, what are we offering? We know that there's a number of determinants of delay of sexual debut by adolescents. But what are we giving them in terms of ideology or plausible explanation? Whereas they face all sorts of rationales to delay or to simply prohibit themselves indefinitely from their religious affiliations or other sources of ideological. What do we give them? What do we offer in terms of why is it good, directly, that they should delay their sexual debut?
And why don't we grab one more and then we'll turn it over to the speakers. Well, we're going to grab mine then. I have a question. I think all of you spoke a bit about that there would be some differences between how we approach working with girls and working with boys. So for Lorette, if you could talk specifically, I know the Egypt example you put up had the number of males and females. And then Jean, if you could talk about, when we talk about developmental assets, if there's different priorities or different ones that resonate different depending on the gender. So I don't know if anybody in particular wants to get us started in any of those 3 questions that were just posed.
I'll start with your question about girls and boys. In many of our programs, we started working with girls, and the families and the communities and the boys themselves said, we want to have this. You know, they saw it as a valuable thing. And, you know, they learned from their sisters and their, you know, various friends in the community that, you know, there's something of value to this kind of programming. And so we did change the curriculum to address questions, and this brings up your question. One of the big issues was masturbation, for boys especially. And, you know, because of all the rumors and myths and that kind of thing. So we do address those issues. You know, it's really depends on the context in each country. In Egypt, I think the differences came about, I mean, again, it started with girls and moved on to boys. And the boys really had problems with controlling themselves. There was a lot of anger and that kind of thing. So that's why the finding that they, you know, felt more in control of themselves and their emotions, and they got some grip on that kind of masculine, if you will, behavior, and really, you know, could explore different ways to deal with that. So they had coping mechanisms. And what do we offer? Why is it good? Well, you know, like I said, the value, once we started this type of work with adolescents and talking about delaying sex and, you know, why they need to do that, it's to build those things, to know themselves, to build those assets, if you will, those personal assets, without, you know, getting into all the realm of all the emotional turmoil that sexuality and sex itself, and, you know, the risks, the you know, unsafe abortion, early childbearing, and all the attendant risks to women.
I just wanted to add something to
why should girls delay sexual initiation? And I think that in some places in the world where there aren't job opportunities, where there isn't schooling opportunities, that having sex and getting pregnant is a viable option. So I think, in addition to giving young women the message that it's important to delay childbearing, then we have to have other options in place for them. We have to have schooling, we have to have employment, we have to have things for them to do, because otherwise it's a very realistic, rational choice to get married at 14 or 15 if there's nothing else for you to do in your life. At the same time, though, I think that a fair number of young women around the world are coerced or forced into marriage. They're coerced into sexual situations. So it's not only just talking to girls about the importance of delaying, but it's also talking with their families and the communities about the benefits to girls and the communities and the families if girls are able to delay sexual initiation and to delay pregnancy. So there's multiple benefits for mothers and children in terms of the health, the social, economic opportunities. But these things go hand in hand, and this is why I think we're trying to promote more of a cross-sectoral, integrated approach, that it's not just about health, but it's education, it's employment, it's civic participation, that everybody has these opportunities.
And I would agree this notion of how do we begin the respectful conversation about the norms in a society, and how do we work on that, or what we want for our kids, and beginning to have those dialogues. And then this is part of that. I think this is a critical part of that conversation. So, I think that's, when it's an isolated issue, it tends to be more flashpoint. And if you build it into how are we raising our kids, and what do we want for our kids, and what our kids want for themselves, and that notion of empowerment of them to find their own choices where their choices available. Two things on assets and gender. In the United States, girls tend to have more assets than boys. So there's some other thing. We have a whole conversation about what's going on there and what's happening with our boys here. That doesn't seem to always be the case in other countries. So obviously you would expect some of that. We did work with Save the Children on a study in Bangladesh of looking at a girls' empowerment project, and we're able through that project to see sort of focusing on identifying out of measuring the assets. Empowerment is a real challenge, putting some work there, and then really seeing some delay in marriage out of those efforts and those kind of things, and really a change in asset levels actually across about a 9-month period. So the notion that focusing in on some areas with the assets with girls that really mattered for them. My hunch is with boys, some things around constructive use of time might be a real opening for them. That category of assets around sports, for example. A bit of a stereotype, I know, but just sort of as a way of illustrating the differences in gender of both where their realities are and where their interests and sparks are, where they really care about things in the world, to take it on and begin to build their own strengths.
I didn't want to ignore your question about masturbation, because I know we're all uncomfortable with the topic, so I didn't want to ignore it. I think for me, a lot of it is not necessarily talking about masturbation per se, but it's more of a normalizing of sexual behavior and sexuality, and recognizing that 10 to 14 is when puberty happens. There's all these things that are happening to your body, and what's happening is a normal thing. It's not an aberration. It's not a disease. It's not some freak of nature. This is a normal thing, which includes sexual feelings, which includes interest in touching yourself. And so I'm not sure a lot of the programs that we work with would go out and actively promote masturbation as an option, but I think that they can do a much better job of promoting sort of this is a normal phase of life, and it's not something to fear. But here's some strategies and some ways of getting through it. I also wanted to just say something about when I worked in Jamaica, one of the things that was really interesting there was that boys were falling behind girls. Like you said, they have fewer assets. And one of the things that I felt that was going on was there was this sort of demonizing of boys in some of these countries, like where the girls. And I remember having this conversation with my daughter, where the girls were all very well behaved and they sat in class and they listened. And so the boys acted out, because they couldn't sit still, they couldn't sit in their chairs. And one of the ways they would punish the boys for acting out in class was to take away their recess time, And so, and it became this thing that like girls' behavior is good and normal and desired, and boys' behavior is aberrant and wrong and bad.
And I think that might contribute to some of the lack of assets, because they're internalizing this cultural notion that boys are just bad.
Well, and the, just at that age, you know,
Yeah.
as I said, the girls develop at a faster rate.
and they're much more compliant.
But energy.
The microphone's coming. It's right behind you.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Martha Brady, the Population Council, and sorry, I was on a train that was delayed. But anyway, I caught some of everyone's presentation. I just have a couple of comments. Actually, the Population Council has done actually quite a bit of work on looking cross-sectorally at approaches to reaching adolescents and younger adolescents, et cetera. And so a couple of things that we've learned, and I think it's really important, and that is, particularly if you're talking about younger adolescents. I mean, what happens is that, in fact, below 10, they're boys and girls, and then they get put into this thing called youth, which actually homogenizes gender, and then it actually masks really dramatic differentials in a whole range of things. And so I think we have to unpack that and be clear not to lump them together. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about adolescent sexual activity, I think we have to be clear on what's coerced and what's not, particularly for girls. A 10-year-old girl who's having sex, I gotta tell you, we should send in the police. It's not just a question of sort of like, let's do a, just say no campaign. It's like, no, that's not it. So I think we really have to understand, particularly the younger, we do have good data that shows the younger a girl is, the greater differential in age between a girl and a male partner, the greater likelihood that there's coercion, et cetera. So that's pretty clear. We also do know that, I think Kate mentioned, there are actual differences in regions and places by, in fact, Jamaica, Philippines, I can list them all if I think about it. The girls are doing better on the educational front, and possibly in Egypt. I mean, there are certain places, but so I think, obviously, context matters a lot here. But the other thing that I think is quite important is, it depends on what outcome you're looking for. So you design a program for that outcome. If the outcome is just general empowerment, or if it's actually to delay sexual activity, what is the it? And you need to design for that, and then you need to measure based on that. And I think a lot of it gets kind of mushed and morphed. And one of the things that I don't know if Ishraq was presented at all, but I actually was one of the designers of Ishraq, so I know that pretty well. And one of the things that's really clear is we need to, what I call sort of empower girls and enlighten boys at the same time. So those two pieces need to go hand in hand, but I would also argue that in most places of the developing world, girls basically do have fewer assets. They have less access to financial institutions and assets, et cetera. So just one thing I have to say on the sports. I think it's great for boys to play sports, but actually what it does is just confirms male stereotypes in a way. Where you see a really big difference is when girls enter the playing field. And then you see a sea change. And actually I just wrote an op-ed in Newsday just last week about this, so if you want, you can look at that. I have more to say, but I'll actually be quiet now.
Does anybody want to make any comments before we collect another question on any of that?
I just wanted to say that I think this is the big challenge, is these kind of longitudinal studies that show the impact of an intervention in a 10 or an 11-year-old, and then does it actually 5 years or 6 years down the road delay the sexual initiation, increase the use of family planning. And I think, for like the types of projects we do, we don't work in those time frames. So I think this is why the work of Search Institute is really important, because they're helping us to try to make that kind of connection between the inputs and the outcomes of that we want to see.
And, go ahead.
I'm just going to, since I'm the one who reinforced the stereotype. It's a great point, actually, because we began working in the States, and I'd be really interested in how this plays out in other contexts, of asking kids what things in life bring you passion, joy, curiosity, your spark, and we asked what those things were, and arts came up for both boys and girls just about as high as sports. So we're kind of neglecting this interest in music, drama, art, other things, and there are other things as well. But I just, to reinforce your point, sometimes the things that young boys or young girls can be passionate about may be hidden by cultural norms that we haven't paid attention to. And listening to them, empowering them to do the things that they are passionate about on an individual and group basis is probably a better way to frame it anyway. So thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Yes. Nice to meet you as well, Martha. And I didn't really have time to present a whole lot on Ishrat, but did present about the innovation of adding sports for girls and how that has been, it did help them to enjoy the sessions more, be more free and open, and really allowed them to be safe in a space and get some of that energy out of them. And another important thing from a lot of these programs is girls are often isolated, and when you bring them together with their peers, they really thrive. That's really important, that connection.
Why don't we grab, while you're over there, grab that question, and then we'll come over to this side.
Just follow up on what you're saying, that girls are isolated. Often they're also so buried in work at home,
Oh, yeah,
right? Having
absolutely.
the opportunity. And what kind of projects are working more with community or parents to get them to free girls' time up more? I know the project in Nepal with Save the Children did some work with the young boys, the brothers, getting them to be more aware. But are there other projects out there that are working, especially maybe with the male head of household, to see, what things he could do? Or
Well, a lot of the programs that I mentioned have included the outreach to parents and communities and trying to get them to advocacy with them, the intergenerational communication, especially in the South African context where some of the parents and caregivers, because we were also dealing with children, girls very much affected by HIV, and they had to, we had sessions with the parents and sessions with the peer-led sessions with youth, and then brought them together to learn to talk to each other about issues that were very sensitive. And some of the caregivers and parents didn't realize the role models they were setting, that were negative stereotypes and that kind of thing. So it was really beneficial for parents as well. And they and several of the programs, the New Horizons and New Vision, girls were New Horizons, I should say. The parents appreciated more what their girls were capable of doing, and that was really important outcome.
Carolyn, I believe we have some questions up here in the front.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Portiller, and I work for the Society for Public Health Education here in the district. So my question actually had a lot to do with societal norms, and once you pull these young people out from their parents and get them with their peers and teach them there, my question was much like what you just answered about how do we then put them back into their living situation and hope that they keep what they've learned with their peers in a place where it might not be supported because of societal norms. So that was my question. I think you kind of answered it. So.
But if you have anything else to say, I just wanted to sort of comment on what Marjorie was saying too. There was a Pathfinder was doing some work in northern Nigeria with girls, like married adolescents, where marriage is there's a lot of early marriage. And so what they did was they worked with religious leaders to try to find ways to encourage them to help the girls go back to school, even if they were married. And so, helping them understand the benefits of girls' education and to, just to get out of the household, and even though that or to learn economic skills. And so there was these Islamia schools that were set up by very religious, devout Muslim women in these communities. And so it wasn't like the girls had to go a long distance to go to school, but these were little community schools that were set up within the communities, and so that there was still this sense that the community could kind of keep an eye on the girls, but it got them out of the house and got them into schools. And so once they were in ostensibly to learn about the Quran, then because these women were very well respected in the community, they were able to introduce English and math and science and other things, and then also then led them on to other vocational skills training opportunities. So I thought that was really interesting, but it was really getting the religious leaders and the traditional leaders on board to help them understand that this was going to benefit the entire community if these girls didn't just get married and start having babies one after another, but if they got an education, they had some kind of a skill. So that was kind of an interesting approach, but it was really tapping into the religious faith of those communities. And that gets, I think, into some of what you were talking about of changing these kind of social norms in a different way of looking at young people and valuing them, and not just as wives and mothers, but as, participating members of the community. There's a question over there.
We'll grab this one and then we'll head over to that side again. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Beth Alderson. I'm with Save the Children, and I just wanted to add on to this comment about the importance of the enabling environment when you have young people that are in a program such as Ishraq, where they're becoming empowered and they're learning about we can equalize norms. We don't have to be socialized to be a certain way. But then if parents and teachers and other caring adults aren't on board or aren't thinking about how they can support that change, then you run the risk of the whole thing kind of falling apart. So we have a curriculum called Choices that we're working on with young adolescents, and then there's an accompanying one called Promises for the caring adults that's been piloted in Nepal, and we're hoping to pilot it in other countries as well. And another thing that we're doing is we are developing puberty workbooks. I know it sounds funny to call them puberty workbooks. We should probably call it very young adolescent workbooks. But the idea is that young people would have something that, there's one for girls and one for boys. And I think Columbia University has also been doing this in various countries. But the idea is that it's something that, for example, a girl can take home, and it really helps to challenge the gender norms in that community and addresses a lot of other issues like sexual initiation, household chores, all sorts of other things going on in that context. So it's a talking piece for the family, and everybody starts discussing it, and the hope is that this will make lasting changes in the lives of these kids. So we would like to look at what that means in terms of developmental assets for those kids. Thanks.
I think I've seen about 3 hands go across this back over there, so we'll get to those.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jennifer Redner here on behalf of the International Women's Health Coalition. I just wanted to start off by thanking the panelists and thanking Wilson Center for having this important discussion today. I think it's really critical that we continue to tease out these various issues, and I really appreciated some of the comments around the issues of coerced sex, the issue of human rights, the issues of early and forced marriage, and how the decision to initiate sex is often not a girl's decision to begin with, and how we know that the vast, vast majority of sexual activity is taking place within the context of marriage among girls in the developing world. And, clearly, as we think more and more about these situations, I hope, seeing everyone around this room, it's really exciting that so many different faces are here all wanting to learn about this. And my sincere hope is that, and belief is that we're all here hoping that we're going to be able to secure a just, prosperous, and healthy future for all young people, not necessarily the outcome, to Martha's point, that we're seeking is not to delay sexual debut, but that it is a positive outcome from securing this just and healthy and prosperous future for young people. Those are my comments. My question is actually to Jean around the data collection, and again, noting how valuable this information is, and just curious, unpacking the violence prevention and unpacking some of the sexual initiation questions that you're asking both in the developing country context, but also among U.S. youth. Are you unpacking the sexual coercion question, and if so, could you give a sense of how? Thank you.
In the study we did in the 4 countries, we did not examine that particular question, so I can't address it there. We have the data in the U.S. and we haven't looked at it for a while, but it's certainly there, and it's a whole different set of realities there. So I can't really speak to it. It's obviously a key issue. I can't speak to it from the data.
There is the very first person.
Hi, I'm Maggie Fox with NBC News, and I want to ask if any of the research that you've done translates to the U.S. Are there lessons that people involved in domestic policy here in the States can take away from the work that you're doing overseas?
Well, yeah, I think policymakers can learn a lot from the work that we've done in various countries around the world. We appreciate the generous support of USAID on many of these programs, and other donors such as Packard and MacArthur Foundations. But for policymakers, I think they need to understand the real opportunities to help children and young adolescents and adolescents make great, better countries, better, stronger communities by having these assets, by having these programs that assist them to delay sex, address early marriage, those kinds of things. It's really important to invest in the developing world.
Yes, and the other thing I would say, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Most of our research has been done in the States, and what's fascinating to me as we begin doing more work in developing countries is that initially our U.S. research was assumed to be only for kids who had it all together. That you only deal with positive development once you've taken care of everything else. And what we're learning in developing contexts, which I think is true in this country as well, is by paying attention to developing and empowering children and youth in all walks of life in this culture is part of what lifts them up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just waiting till they've got everything else solved. It all goes together. So for me, what we're learning in Bangladesh and what we're learning in Rwanda and what we're learning in all these other places is leading to helping us understand that building strong kids can happen even in dire circumstances, overseas and in inner city or rural United States.
I think one of the interesting things that in a lot of the developing countries where I've worked is, most countries, for better or worse, have a ministry of youth. And many countries now have youth policies. Oftentimes they're developed with the encouragement of USAID and other donors. And so, these ministries of youth are often kind of weak. I think we'd like to see them strengthened. But those exist. And so there's at least, some kind of a recognition on the part of the government that, these are important. These are important to the overall country context. I think I was just in Madagascar recently, and one of the things Madagascar is trying to do is trying to recognize that we need to do a better job of pulling these various ministries together. And so any ministry that works or has some sort of an impact on youth, there needs to be some kind of interministerial collaboration and coordination and looking for more of a collective impact. So trying to get health and education and justice and labor and these various ministries at the table and looking at how overall their policies and programs have an effect or can do more to sort of, lift youth up, which I think is really interesting. I don't think you see that in the United States, at least at the federal level.
But I think we're learning that from the HIV work in developing countries, because that's cross-sectoral work has really, really been important.
Mm-hmm.
We have two here in the middle. Oh, possibly.
Hi, my name is Nafis Ahmed, and I'm with the United Nations Information Center. I have a question for Kate. I'm coming at this from a more inexperienced perspective, but I've done a bit of development work in Pakistan, and I was wondering, in Pakistan, women's issues and reproductive health is such a comprehensive issue, and it has so many implications. Parents don't want to send their children to school send their girls to school because they'll get married early, so they won't generate income for their family, and they want their girls to get married early so that they don't have sex out of marriage, and then once they're married, they don't have opportunities for education, and that leads to health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering how USAID works, and maybe if you could provide a specific example of a comprehensive approach that you utilize.
You know, I'm going to defer. Is Rashna here? Rashna, are you here? Or did she leave? I mean, I know USAID Pakistan is doing work on youth. I don't really know the ins and outs, and I'm just so sorry Russia's not here because she's Pakistani and she's done a lot of work with the Pakistan mission. I don't know if there's anybody else that wants to. Do you accept working in Pakistan?
No. But the issues are similar in
Yeah.
all of South Asia, I
Yeah.
think.
What about Usha? Usha, do you have familiarity with that? Yeah, I mean, I know there's, people have said that, that Pakistan's interested in doing more work with youth, and I think a lot of the work in Pakistan has been around, counterterrorism stuff. So, but I'm sorry, I don't really know specifically, but you could follow up with me.
Could you provide an example of somewhere else in South Asia, or just a country that seems similar to that? I'm just interested in more of a specific example, no matter where it is.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
Oh.
Martha looks
Oh,
like she
Martha.
really wants to have a say here.
I'm sorry, Martha.
I'm not an expert on Pakistan, but I think what I hear behind your question is this sort of vicious cycle, basically,
Yeah.
is sort of like the need to protect daughters from
Right.
men, from being outside, from all sorts of
Right.
things, which is not dissimilar to rural Upper Egypt, actually.
Right, or
where
Northern Nigeria.
the concerns about sort of, allowing girls out because of the, watchful gaze of men and et cetera. So you have, seriously, so you have that, and then that means that they're not in school. What you did say, though, once girls are
Married.
actually in school, they're more likely actually to do better than not being in school. And they're likely to marry later, not earlier,
Yeah,
if they're in
right.
school, because it's sort of, Right. So you have the issue of girls' labor for the household.
Right.
Then you have issue of the need to protect young women because of the cultural dictates, and that I think is true in many places. It's more pronounced in some places than others. And so I mean I don't think there's obviously an easy answer, but I do think that in those kind of situations, and this is what we did do with in Upper Egypt, is you have to, from the get-go, have to really get the community really bought into, and you have to figure out in any of the work that we do, and I agree with Beth's point here about you have to, I think it's basic good programming principles, you have to include parents and the key gatekeepers, and if they're the brothers of the girls and whatever. But I do think, and this is a tricky one, you have to figure out, if you're talking about at the policy level, what is the rationale?
Yeah.
What is the rationale for program X or Y? And without that, it's like pushing a string up a hill. Believe me, I've done that. I've done that too.
Well,
Anyway,
and then because policymakers don't want to get involved with the religious leaders and
Right. And so if you look at to the question about how does this relate to the U.S. too, I mean, I think the one thing that strikes me is, first is, we have the largest cohort of young people in the world today between the age of 10 and 24. So it has the largest demographic bulge ever, which is really important for communities, societies, and for those individuals. And even though there's a huge amount of differences in contexts and situations, I mean, we do know that the education assets and economic assets, having those two are really, really fundamental, regardless of place. And and without those two pieces, it's hard to see how you delay sexual activity. There's all that seems like, without those two earlier stages, I think it's hard to get there. So anyway, I didn't answer anyone's question, but I could go on. That's my other show. It's called Just Ask Martha.
I think there's a question right here. Yeah.
And then she's got her hand up here.
I'm Ray Martin from Christian Connections for International Health. Hi, Lynette. Can we connect our conversation here today for a couple minutes with the challenge of HIV prevention? In CCIH, for a long time, we've been promoting delayed sexual debut and fidelity in a relationship as a very effective strategy for HIV prevention. And certainly in religious communities, that message generally goes over very well. I don't know if any of you went to the International AIDS Conference last month in Washington, but it was a bit disconcerting to me that at the IAC, with 24,000 people from around the world, there was almost no discussion of behavior change or promoting healthy behaviors as an efficacious strategy for HIV prevention. Almost everyone seemed to prefer a biomedical model. You know, nowadays, treatment as prevention is the mantra. And so I'm just wondering whether any of you have any perspectives on the challenge of HIV prevention, which is, in many communities, a huge risk as young people develop and grow, and how the kind of approaches and programs that you've advocated might fit into an HIV prevention strategy, and how do we connect these perspectives that we may have with the biomedical community who seems oblivious to this approach to HIV prevention?
I did hear that come out of the IAC, and I think that it's interesting because even those biomedical interventions require behavior change to be successful. So you can't leave it out. It's hugely important to be adherent to your treatment. It's hugely difficult, and it requires a lot of work on behavior. And, you know, I mean, even for male circumcision, you know, changing the behavior and so that you don't think it's a free pass to have sex with anybody and everybody. It's a behavior change approach. So I think it was an interesting dichotomy there that nobody was mentioning it, but I do believe that it cannot be. You have to include behavior change. There's no one silver bullet.
Why don't we get the one right, Suzanne, right behind you, and then we'll move up.
Hi,
And
just
then we'll
a
go over there.
very quick comment on this. Suzanne Petroni, the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW. And just to follow up on Ray's point, I think we are, as a community, whether it's the donor community, the implementing agencies, the researchers, missing huge opportunities here to educate and integrate. So, they're now putting men on buses to go out and get circumcised as a prevention of HIV treatment. While they're on the bus to go to the circumcision camp, they have these very rapid things. They're back in a day. But while they're on the bus or while they're waiting, why not educate them about broader sexual and reproductive health issues, about gender norms and roles when they're in for their treatment, getting ARVs? I mean, the siloization that we have created and the biomedicalization has really harmed our efforts at achieving what is supposed to be this whole approach to global health. So hopefully now that the Global Health Initiative officially is, at least the office is going away, but hopefully the approach is continuing. The USAID can continue the efforts that it started toward integration, and other donors can do that. But we all need to think about that in our program design and implementation as well. What are the ways that we can just very easily, not huge cost, just tack on these other elements that can help us achieve what we all want?
I'm Dr. Hannah Claus from the Teen Star program. I appreciated what everyone has said. I'd like to pick up a little bit on what Ray Martin has said, since I also belong to his organization. I think you have an asset that hasn't been mentioned, and that's the one that we work with in our program. We begin by teaching young women around the age of puberty to understand and value their fertility pattern. And we find that becomes a very empowering thing. And I find most girls need about 3 cycles around before they begin to say, this is me. And then what you hear is self-discovery and self-confidence. USAID is funding this as an HIV prevention, but we began it, frankly, to delay pregnancy and to delay the outcomes of premature, what I call sexual relations. It works for both things. I've just come from our international meeting in Korea, where they have this program for very young, mostly for the age group that you're targeting, early and middle adolescents. In Uganda and Ethiopia, of course, this is HIV prevention, but you happen to, you can kill two birds with one stone if you delay sexual debut until people are hopefully a little bit grown up. Then they can form relationships which are more mature instead of being totally driven by emotion. An awful lot of youngsters go directly from emotional attraction to sex. They miss all the points of developing relationships. This may sound very old-fashioned, but human nature has been the same for a number of decades, perhaps millennia. And you still need to be grown up in order to make adult decisions. So I would suggest looking at the asset of understanding and valuing your fertility rather than simply saying, yes, it's there, let's do something to remove it medically or chemically. There are other ways of dealing with it. Thank you.
Question right up here.
Promise I won't hog the mic. I just have another question. As we were talking about the challenge of delaying sex, and that's one of the part of the title of today's discussion, I am going to move this back to domestic policy. I don't know how much, or I guess the domestic landscape. I'm not sure how applicable this is to international, because I'm not that familiar. But I just want to discuss media influence, because our youth are bombarded by media all over the place, whether we like it or not. And even with as many developmental assets as they could, I mean, maybe they had all 40, I don't know, but I still feel like maybe media might play a role in their decision to or not to initiate sex at an early age. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how we can address media. I mean, when we have shows like Teen Mom, who I don't even know what the point of Teen Mom is. I think it's supposed to make young people not want to have babies, but I also think that maybe that's a double-edged sword as well. So I'm just wondering what your opinions are on media and a youth's decision to initiate sex.
So, I'll speak to it just from a couple of points. One is I'm not an expert in how you influence media to change its behavior, and you get into all kinds of debates about censorship and all, and so we can go there, but that's a long discussion. What we find is also really valuable is teaching critical media literacy to kids and families, and essentially you're seeing it, let's deconstruct what you're seeing and take away some of the power by understanding it. And I know that I've done that with my own kids. What did you see? Teachable moment. How are we going to deal with it? And doesn't mean that other efforts shouldn't be underway, but for me, that's one that I personally can get my head around. How to tackle. So maybe there's some other perspectives. So
USAID has supported a lot of mass media in developing countries, which is very positive. So soap operas in Latin America have been really powerful in terms of changing norms. Radio programs, I mean, there's been some great radio programs that have been done in Kenya where like it was targeted to young people, but when they went back and they did audience surveys, it was like the entire community stopped to listen to this radio program about, something that was happening to young people. They have call-in programs. So there's a lot of very positive media that's out there, which isn't to say that there isn't a lot of negative media. And I'll sort of relate back to my experience when I was a Peace Corps volunteer when I lived in a small village in Ghana, and they would have blue movie nights, which was the XXX rated videos that and the entire community would turn out to watch these videos because it was like entertainment, And so, I remember at the time just kind of going, how do you deal with something like that, And then also being sort of walking through town the next day and just kind of going, why are people looking at me like that? Because you realize a lot of people in those blue movies are white women.
Exactly.
So they're like, we know what you do behind closed doors. So, but it was like kind of horrifying. But that everybody turns out to watch the XXX special from grandma down to the babies, and so that there is that exposure in some of these countries, in communities that they're making money off of it. So.
I had the same experience in the Solomon Islands, except it was Rambo films.
Violence too.
Violence,
yeah.
And real macho,
bloody
stereotyping. But the thing is that Media is, I think, we're looking at so much change and so much interconnection. I mean, look at the Arab Spring. I don't think we have a grasp yet on how this kind of rapid transfer of information is really functioning in the developing world around sexual norms. If in fact it's getting better because there is more access to positive, or just more access to information.
Just the other point is the youth-created media, particularly now that you have the internet, is a whole other opportunity for positive impact in a media environment. The media is so diverse and so fragmented now that but that makes it both a real challenge but also a really opportunity for how do we begin addressing norms in that context.
Probably grab these last two and then wrap up.
choice to have a healthy sexual and reproductive life at any age throughout their lifetime, and to empower them to make those decisions. So it requires us to look at things like coerced sex, early marriage, many other factors that are not just the goal of delaying sex. And I think that's the same is true for HIV prevention. We know that just delaying sex for HIV prevention is not effective. It doesn't work. What we know is that allowing people to have a range of choices, like using condoms or other options, including the ability to delay sex if they choose to do so, is really what's effective. And I think from that approach, we're talking about the same strategies, both from a sort of reproductive health and a sexual health standpoint. So I just wanted to raise that point. Thank you.
One more right here.
Hi. My name is Elizabeth Berard, and I work here at USAID in the Office of HIV. And I wanted to touch bases really quickly on male circumcision and the comment around male circumcision and biomedical interventions. And I actually had a conversation last week with Emmanuel and Gemelli, who is one of our male circumcision specialists here at USAID. It was actually really interesting because we were talking about adolescents and male circumcision. And while USAID and PEPFAR, we are very much targeting older males, in fact, over 50% of those that show up for male circumcision interventions are actually under the age of 20, which is really quite interesting. In fact, in Tanzania, Emmanuel noted that 85% of those that are showing up are younger than 20. So I think that's really, really interesting, first of all. And he said, you know, a lot of parents are actually very supportive of their sons being circumcised because they know about this and they want their sons to be protected. I did want to say, just, you know, regarding using this as a teachable moment, there is comprehensive prevention messaging that is going on within the PEPFAR-supported activities around male circumcision, and that includes for the very young boys that are showing up. It does include abstinence as appropriate for the very young. It also includes instructions and discussions on condoms for those that are sexually active. It also includes, discussions on just sexually transmitted diseases and counseling and testing for HIV, kind of the whole 9 yards. So using this opportunity is absolutely the appropriate it's the appropriate opportunity to really be stepping in there and talking about a lot of what young men need to know about HIV. So I just wanted to jump in with that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. So I want to encourage everybody to continue to have this conversation. One of the ways you can do that is by visiting our blog at newsecuritybeat.org or also our website, wilsoncenter.org. Please check them out. And I want to thank all of you for making this discussion great and ask you to join me in thanking our speakers today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. We had a really great turnout.
It was a good turnout and a good lively discussion.